You touch her again, Lawrence Turner, and I will burn every deed you own to ash." Eloise Carter's voice didn't shake. Her hand did, but only because she was pressing it flat against the table to keep herself from throwing the glass. Caleb Dawson stood 3 feet away, watching his new wife face down the most dangerous man in Dry Creek County, and for the first time in his life, he had absolutely nothing to say. He had married her 4 days ago because his uncle made him. He was starting to think his uncle had known something he didn't. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly who this was made for. Subscribe to our channel right now, hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Caleb Dawson read it twice before he crumpled it in his fist. His uncle Roy never wrote letters. Roy Dawson was a man of face-to-face confrontations, whiskey-soaked decisions, and handshake deals that bound you whether you liked it or not. So when Caleb found the envelope tucked under his front door, not mailed, not sent, but physically placed there, which meant Roy had ridden out to the ranch himself and hadn't even bothered to knock, he already knew it wasn't good news. He read it a third time. "The bank has called in the note on Thornfield Ranch. You have 60 days before they foreclose. I have arranged a solution. Come to town Thursday. Don't be late. Don't argue. Uncle Roy." Caleb set the letter on the table and stared at the wall for a long time. He had known the finances were tight. He hadn't known they were that tight. The drought the previous summer had cut his cattle yield by nearly a third. He'd borrowed against the property to buy feed, and then the feed prices had climbed, and then one of his hands had quit, and then the fence along the north pasture had collapsed in a windstorm, and he'd had to repair it himself over 3 days. While the cattle wandered, it had been one thing after another, all of it manageable, all of it survivable, until, apparently, it wasn't. Thursday came fast. Caleb rode into Dry Creek before 10 in the morning and found his uncle already seated at a corner table in the Cattleman's Bank meeting room. Not the saloon, not the feed store, but the bank, which told Caleb this was official in a way he wasn't prepared for. Roy Dawson was 63 years old, thick across the chest, with a gray beard he never fully trimmed, and eyes that always looked like they were calculating something you hadn't thought of yet. Sitting beside him was a man Caleb recognized, Gerald Pruitt, the bank manager, with his small hands folded on the table, and his expression carefully neutral. "Sit down, Caleb," Roy said. "Tell me what's happening first." "Sit down, then I'll tell you." Caleb sat. Roy laid it out plainly, the way he always did. No softening, no apology. The bank had called in the note because Caleb had missed 2 payments, and the outstanding balance was larger than Caleb had realized because of compounding interest he hadn't tracked carefully enough. The ranch Thornfield was worth enough to cover the debt, but only if sold outright. If Caleb wanted to keep it, he needed an immediate infusion of capital, real capital. Not a new loan. The bank wouldn't extend another loan to a property already under foreclosure notice. "So what's the solution?" Caleb asked. Roy looked at him steadily. "The Carter land." Caleb didn't say anything. "You know the Carters. Thomas Carter died last spring. Left his daughter Eloise the east parcel, 40 acres clean deed, no debt on it. That land borders yours on the southeast corner. If it were combined with Thornfield, the combined property value would be enough collateral for the bank to restructure the whole note." Gerald Pruitt cleared his throat. "We would be willing to restructure, yes, given the combined asset value." Caleb looked between them. "Then I'll make an offer to buy the Carter land." "You have no money to buy it," Roy said, not unkindly. "Eloise Carter has no reason to sell it to you at a price you could afford. She's been offered fair market value by Lawrence Turner twice, and she's refused both times. She's holding that land because it's the only thing she has left." "Then I don't see what the solution is." Roy picked up his coffee cup, drank from it, set it down. "The solution is that you marry her." The room went very quiet. Caleb heard his own breathing. He heard the clock on the wall. He heard a horse somewhere outside shifting its weight on the packed dirt. "Say that again," he said. "You heard me." "Uncle Roy, I have spoken with Eloise Carter," Roy said, and his voice didn't waver. I went to her 3 weeks ago before I wrote to you because I wanted to know if it was even possible before I brought it to you. She is a practical woman. She understands the situation. She has agreed conditionally to consider the arrangement. She's agreed to consider marrying a man she doesn't know because you walked up to her door and proposed it on his behalf. She's agreed to consider a practical arrangement that saves her land from the only other offer she has, which is Lawrence Turner, who she doesn't trust, and saves your ranch from foreclosure. Yes, that's what I said. Caleb pushed back from the table. He didn't stand up. There wasn't enough room in him for that yet, but he needed the distance. I'm 29 years old. I've got 60 days to save a ranch I've worked for 6 years, and your solution is to marry a woman I don't know. A woman you don't know well, Roy corrected. You've seen Eloise Carter at church, at the general store. You know who she is. I know the town calls her the old maid. Roy's jaw tightened. The town calls her whatever is convenient. She's 28. She's educated. She's run her father's household since she was 17, and she has more sense than half the men in Dry Creek County. The old maid talk is gossip, and you're smarter than to let gossip be your deciding factor. Caleb looked at Gerald Pruitt. Is there any other option? Pruitt's expression didn't change. Not one that lets you keep the property, Mr. Dawson. He didn't say yes that day. He rode home, worked through the afternoon. Didn't eat dinner, sat on the porch until the stars were fully out, and then went to bed and lay awake until close to 3 a.m. Then he got up, lit the lamp, and wrote a short note to Roy. Set up the meeting. I'll hear her terms. The meeting happened at the Carter House, a small, well-kept place on the eastern side of town, with a vegetable garden along the side wall that was visibly tended, and a front step that had been recently repaired with new wood. Caleb noticed the new wood because it was slightly lighter than the old boards, and he thought without meaning to that she'd done it herself. Eloise Carter answered the door before he finished knocking. She was not what he'd built in his head. He wasn't sure exactly what he'd built, but it wasn't this. She was medium height with dark hair pulled back practically not decoratively. Her eyes were direct hazel. He registered the kind of hazel that was more green than brown in certain light, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they've already thought through thoroughly, and are now simply confirming. Not with warmth exactly, not with coldness, with assessment. Mr. Dawson, she said, come in. Roy was already seated inside, which meant he'd arrived early, and told her to open the door herself, which was classic Roy. Caleb sat across from Eloise at a plain wooden table, and for a moment nobody said anything. Then she said, I'll be direct if that's all right. Please, Caleb said. I don't want to marry you, she said. I want to be clear about that from the start, so neither of us wastes time on pretense. I don't know you, you don't know me, and if I had any other reasonable option, I wouldn't be sitting here. But I don't. Lawrence Turner has been circling my land for 2 years, and he won't stop. If I sell to him, I lose the only asset my father left me, and I have nothing. If I hold out alone, I have no way to generate enough income off 40 acres to maintain the property long term. So I've thought about your situation, and I think there is a version of this arrangement that could be practical for both of us. Caleb looked at her. All right. The 40 acres combines with your land. The bank restructures. You keep the ranch. In exchange, I have full authority over the Carter parcel. It stays in my name, jointly held, and I have a voice in decisions that affect it. I'm not coming to Thornfield to cook and keep quiet. I'll work. I have ideas about the property that I believe could improve the yield. You don't have to like them, but you have to be willing to hear them. And if we don't get along, Caleb said, then we are 2 adults who don't get along and still have a functioning ranch, she said. People make it work all the time. Caleb looked at Roy, who was studying the wall with the focused attention of a man trying very hard not to smile. He looked back at Eloise. You've thought about this more than I have. I've had 3 weeks, she said. I would imagine you've had less than 1. 4 days. Then you're behind. I'd suggest catching up. Chapter. They were married on a Saturday at the church with Roy as witness, and Eloise's neighbor Mrs. Holt as the other. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Eloise wore a blue dress that wasn't a wedding dress, and Caleb wore his cleanest shirt, and afterward, Roy slapped him on the back and said, "You'll thank me." And Caleb said nothing, because he didn't trust his voice. The drive back to Thornfield was quiet, not uncomfortable, or not entirely uncomfortable. Eloise sat straight on the wagon bench and watched the land as they moved through it, and once she asked, "What's the water source for the north pasture?" And when Caleb told her there was a creek that ran seasonal, she nodded and said, "That's what I thought. We'll need to dig a secondary well before summer." Then she went quiet again. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the house and got down and went to help her down, and she'd already stepped down. Herself was already standing, looking at the front of the house with that same assessing expression she'd had when she first looked at him. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "Is that good or bad?" "It means there's more to work with." She picked up her bag, just the one, and walked to the front door. "Will you show me the property lines tomorrow?" "Sure," he said. "Good." She went inside. Caleb stood in the yard for a moment, then followed. The first week was a negotiation of territory, mostly silent. Caleb was used to a particular order in his house. He knew where everything was, had developed routines over 6 years of solitary living that had calcified into something he hadn't realized were rules until someone else was present. He kept the coffee on the right side of the stove. He came in from morning chores and sat in the chair by the window before doing anything else. He ate in silence. Eloise didn't disrupt these things. She simply added herself alongside them in a way that was so matter-of-fact, it was almost disorienting. She moved the coffee, not arbitrarily, but because she needed the right side shelf for the sourdough starter she'd brought, and she explained this briefly and without apology. She ate in silence too, but it was a different silence than his. His silence was empty. Hers was full, like she was thinking through something complicated and would surface when she was ready. On the third day, she walked the full property line with him. All of it. Thornfield was just over 300 acres when combined with her 40, and they spent most of the day covering it, and she asked questions the entire time. Not chatty questions, not small talk, but precise, specific questions about soil and fence, condition, and where the cattle grazed at different seasons, and where they'd had water problems before. Caleb answered them. By the afternoon, he realized he was answering in more detail than he usually would, because her follow-up questions required it. "The creek runs dry by July," she said, standing on the southeastern edge looking at the dry creek bed. "Usually late June," he said. "And you lose cattle weight in the summer because they're stressed by the water shortage." "Yes, that's a solvable problem," she said. "My father solved it on our parcel 5 years ago. You dig a retention pond here." She pointed to a low spot in the land during spring when there's flow, and it holds enough for the herd through the dry season. It's labor, but it's one-time labor. Caleb looked at the spot she indicated. He'd walked past that depression 100 times and never thought about it that way. "That would work," he said, and the admission surprised him because it came without resistance. She glanced at him sideways. "You sound surprised." "I'm not surprised the idea works. I'm surprised I didn't think of it." "You were thinking about other things," she said, and walked on. It was on the 5th day that Lawrence Turner showed up. Caleb was inside when he heard the horse, and by the time he got to the door, Turner was already at the gate, not dismounting, just sitting on his horse, with the posture of a man who owned everything he could see, and was merely indulging the formality of stopping. Turner was 40-something, broad, well-dressed, in the way that announced money rather than taste. He had 3 men with him. He always had men with him. "Dawson," Turner called. "Heard you got married." Caleb walked out. "Turner. Wanted to offer my congratulations in person." Turner's voice was easy, friendly in the particular way that held a knife behind it. "I also wanted to make you a business offer. Now that you've got the Carter parcel added to your holdings, combined value of this property is significant. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the whole thing. Cash clean transaction, no bank involvement. The ranch isn't for sale," Caleb said. "Everything's for sale at the right price." Turner smiled. "Take some time. Talk to your wife. I'll come back in a week." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his horse and rode out his men trailing behind him. Caleb stood in the yard, jaw tight. Then he heard the door behind him. Eloise stepped out and stood beside him, watching Turner's dust settle. "He came to you before," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "Twice," she said. "He offered fair market value the first time, above market the second time." "Why didn't you take it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the land was my father's, and because something about Lawrence Turner makes the back of my neck go cold, and I've learned to pay attention to that feeling." Caleb looked at her. "He'll come back." "I know," she said. "He'll keep coming back until we give him a reason to stop." She went back inside. Caleb stood there another moment, and then for the first time in recent memory, he didn't feel like he was facing something alone. He wasn't sure what to do with that feeling. He went back inside too. The second week, Caleb found Eloise in the barn before dawn. He'd gotten up early out of habit and gone to start the morning chores, and she was already there working by lantern light, going through the tack with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times. She'd pulled down a saddle that Caleb had been meaning to repair for weeks and had already begun oiling the leather. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and kept working. He watched her for a moment. "Where did you learn tack work?" "My father. He couldn't afford a hand for the first few years after my mother died, so I learned everything." She didn't say it with self-pity, just as information. "I can also shoe a horse, though I'm slow at it, and I can read a land survey, which will be useful when we need to register the combined deed formally." Caleb sat down on a hay bale across from her. "You really are nothing like what I expected." She looked up. "What did you expect?" He considered being diplomatic. Someone who needed more from this arrangement than she gave. Eloise held his gaze for a moment. "Most people expect that," she said. "It's why I've been called an old maid since I was 22. I didn't want to marry someone who wanted a housekeeper and a warm body. And the men in Dry Creek County who wanted something else weren't looking at me." She went back to the leather. "I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm just explaining." "I don't pity you," Caleb said. "Good," she said. "I'd be annoyed if you did." He almost smiled. He didn't quite, but almost. It was near the end of the second week when Roy came by unannounced, his specialty, and found them at the kitchen table together, going over a rough map of the property that Eloise had drawn from memory, and Caleb had been correcting with measurements. Roy stood in the doorway for a moment, and looked at the two of them, bent over the paper, talking in low, efficient voices about where the new fence line should run, and he had an expression on his face that Caleb caught but couldn't fully read. "Came to see if you'd killed each other," Roy said. "Not yet," Caleb said. Roy looked at Eloise. "He giving you trouble?" "He's tolerable," she said without looking up from the map. Roy made a sound that was definitely a laugh disguised as a cough. "Good. That's good." He sat down and accepted the coffee Eloise put in front of him. She'd done it automatically, without being asked, which surprised Caleb, because Eloise didn't do things automatically for people. And Roy said more quietly, "Turner's been asking around town about the combined deed registration, whether it's been filed yet." The room shifted. Caleb looked up. "He's watching the paperwork timing." "Seems like it," Roy said. "If the combined deed isn't registered before that 60-day window closes, the banknote reverts to its original terms. Turner knows that." Eloise set down her pencil. "He's going to try to delay the filing." "That's what I'd do if I were him," Roy said. Caleb felt the shape of it clicking together in his head. Turner's visit, the timing, the friendly offer that wasn't friendly at all. It wasn't a simple buyout pitch. It was a play. Keep them occupied, delay the paperwork, let the bank window expire, and then pick up Thornfield at foreclosure price with no competition. He looked at Eloise. She was already looking at him. "We file Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. Roy looked between them, and the expression was back, the one Caleb couldn't fully read. Roy picked up his coffee and drank it, and said nothing more about the matter. But his eyes were satisfied in a way that made Caleb for just a moment deeply suspicious about exactly how much his uncle had arranged. They filed Monday morning, and Lawrence Turner knew about it by Monday afternoon. Caleb didn't see how it happened. He and Eloise had gone to the county clerk's office early before most of the town was fully awake. Had the paperwork processed and stamped and officially recorded before 9 o'clock. They'd been careful. They hadn't told anyone the specific day. But by the time they rode back through town, Caleb caught the look on the face of the man sweeping the front step of Turner's land office, a quick glance up, then deliberately away, and he knew. Turner had someone in the clerk's office, or someone who watched the clerk's office, or simply someone in town whose job was to watch and report. Caleb filed that information in the back of his mind without comment. Eloise noticed the same look. He knew because she said nothing about it, and her posture changed, a small, nearly imperceptible shift, the kind of change a person makes when they've just confirmed something they already suspected. "He knows," Caleb said when they were clear of town. "Yes," she said. "Now we'll see what he does next." What Turner did next was not what either of them expected. He sent a woman. Her name was Clara Briggs, and she arrived at Thornfield on Wednesday morning while Caleb was out with the cattle, and Eloise was in the middle of recalculating the water schedule for the new retention pond site. Clara was maybe 40, well-dressed, with the particular careful pleasantness of someone delivering a message they know won't be welcomed. She said she was Turner's business representative, and that she had an offer she'd been authorized to present to Mrs. Dawson directly. Eloise let her in. She told Caleb about it that evening plainly, and in full the way she told him everything, without dramatizing it, but without softening it either. Clara Briggs had offered a sum for the Carter parcel alone, separate from Thornfield, a number high enough that Eloise repeated it and watched Caleb's expression without blinking. "That's more than it's worth," Caleb said. "Significantly more," she agreed. "And she made the offer to you specifically. She said Mr. Turner understood the property had sentimental value for me, and that he was willing to compensate for that." Eloise's voice stayed level. She also mentioned casually that she understood the combined registration was a financial arrangement rather than a personal one, and that she was sure I had my own interest to consider. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He's trying to split us. He's trying to determine whether I can be bought separately." She looked at him directly. "He thinks I'm here because I had no other option, and that given a sufficient amount of money, I'd take it and leave, and the combined deed would dissolve. Would you—" The question came out before Caleb had fully decided to ask it. Eloise looked at him for a moment, not offended, not surprised, just thinking it through honestly. "No," she said. "Not to Turner. Not at any price. Whatever my reasons for this arrangement, I keep my word. And I don't trust what he'd do with that land once he had it." Caleb nodded once. "Good." He paused. "What did you tell Clara Briggs?" "I told her to thank Mr. Turner for his interest, and inform him the Carter parcel was not available separately or otherwise." She picked up her pencil. "And then I showed her the door." Caleb looked at her across the table. Something settled in his chest, something he didn't quite have a name for yet, but that felt like the particular relief of finding out someone is exactly who you thought they might be. "We should tell Roy," he said. "I already sent him a note this afternoon," she said, and went back to her calculations. Roy came the following morning, and he did not look surprised by any of it, which itself was informative. He sat down, heard the full account from Eloise, and then he said, "Turner's changing tactics. The direct offer didn't work because the deed's already filed. The split offer didn't work. He'll go harder next." "What does harder look like?" Caleb said. "It looks like pressure on your creditor's interference with your supply lines or something legal. He's got a lawyer in Santa Fe who specializes in property disputes. If he can find any irregularity in your title history, any gap in the chain of documentation, he'll use it." Eloise set down her coffee. "My father's deed goes back to 1861. It's clean." "Thornfield's deed goes back to my father," Caleb said. "There was a boundary dispute in the late 60s between my father and a man named Holt over the northern corner. It was resolved in my father's favor, but there was a period where the record was contested. Roy looked at him. How well documented is the resolution? I don't know. I inherited the property from my father 8 years ago. His papers are in a box in the back room. I've never had reason to go through all of them. There was a silence. Then you need to go through them, Eloise said. Today. It could take today, she said again, not sharp, just certain. If Turner's lawyer is looking for gaps, we need to know what they'll find before they find it. Caleb looked at Roy, who made a small gesture with his hand that meant, she's right, don't argue. So Caleb didn't argue. They spent the afternoon in the back room with the box of his father's papers. Eloise went through documents with the focused attention of someone who had learned to read legal language out of necessity, scanning each page, sorting, setting aside anything that mentioned boundaries, or surveying, or the name Holt. Caleb read beside her, slower, his jaw tightening each time he found something ambiguous. By late afternoon, they had a pile of documents that might be relevant, and a clearer picture of the dispute. The original survey had placed the northern corner in a slightly different position than the later corrected survey. And while the court had ruled in his father's favor, one particular document, the final signed survey confirmation, was missing from the box. That's the one he'll go after, Eloise said, holding the gap in the sequence up to the light, as if the missing document might materialize. It might be filed with the county, Roy said. It might not be, Caleb said. My father wasn't meticulous about filing. Then we find it, Eloise said. Or we find someone who can testify to what it said. Who did the survey in 1869? A man named Aldous Webb, Roy said slowly. He's dead, but his son Frank is still in Albuquerque. He took over his father's surveying business. Caleb and Eloise looked at each other. One of us needs to go to Albuquerque, she said. I'll go, Caleb said immediately. You can't, she said. If you leave now and Turner knows you're gone, he'll push harder here. He'll show up when you're not present and apply a different kind of pressure. She met his eyes steadily. I'll stay. You go, but go fast and come back faster. Roy cleared his throat. I could go in his place. No, Caleb said. Roy, no offense, but Frank Webb doesn't know you. He knew my father. If I go and explain who I am and what I need, there's a chance he helps. If a stranger shows up asking about a decades-old survey document, the answer is no. Then go, Eloise said. I'll handle things here. Caleb looked at her. Turner's men might come while I'm gone. I know, she said. I'm not afraid of Turner's men. He studied her face for a moment, looking for uncertainty, looking for the flinch she was hiding, because there had to be one. There wasn't. Not that he could find. Whatever Eloise Carter felt about Lawrence Turner and his men, she had put it somewhere he couldn't see, and she was holding steady on the surface, with the calm of someone who has already decided how they'll respond to whatever comes, and is simply waiting. Lock the front gate when I leave, he said. I was planning to. He left the next morning, before light. What happened while Caleb was gone? Eloise pieced together later from the things she could have told him in order, but chose instead to tell all at once when he was back, when there was time to make sense of it together. On the first day, nothing happened. She worked the property, checked the cattle with the help of their one remaining hand, a quiet young man named Pruitt, who asked no questions and did his job, and she started drafting a written account of the boundary dispute from her own reading of the documents in case it was needed. On the second day, a man she didn't recognize rode slowly past the front gate 3 times over the course of the afternoon. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. He just looked. Eloise watched from inside without letting him see her watching, and she sent a note to Roy. Roy came that evening and confirmed what she suspected. The man was one of Turner's irregular presence whenever Turner was putting pressure on someone. He was there to make her nervous, to make her feel watched and alone and vulnerable. Is it working? Roy asked her. No, she said, which was mostly true. On the third day, Turner came himself. He rode up to the gate in the late morning alone this time, which was its own kind of statement. No men, no entourage, just Turner on his horse looking at the house with the patient certainty of a man who believed he would eventually get what he wanted. Eloise went outside. She walked to the gate and stopped on her side of it and looked at him with her hands at her sides, and Turner tipped his hat with the particular politeness that wasn't politeness at all. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "is your husband about?" "He's not," she said. "Gone somewhere. On ranch business." Turner smiled. The smile didn't change the coldness behind his eyes. "I came to apologize," he said, "for the manner of my last offer. I think Clara may have framed things poorly. I don't mean to put pressure on anyone. I'm simply a businessman who sees value where others don't, and I make offers accordingly." "The offer was clearly made," Eloise said, "and clearly declined." Of course. He shifted slightly in the saddle. "I wonder, Mrs. Dawson, and I ask this with genuine goodwill, whether you've fully thought through your situation here. You've entered into an arrangement with a man you barely know, tied your land to a property that was near foreclosure 2 weeks ago, and you're out here alone while he travels. That's a great deal of trust to place in a practical arrangement." Eloise looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Mr. Turner, I've thought through my situation completely, including the part where you're standing at my gate suggesting I shouldn't trust my own husband because you believe that if I feel uncertain enough, I'll sell to you rather than face whatever you're implying. I want to be honest with you. I see exactly what you're doing, and it won't work." Turner's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "You're a sharp woman." "I know," she said. "Good day, Mr. Turner." She turned and walked back to the house, and she did not look back, and she kept her pace even, and unhurried all the way to the front door, and then she went inside and stood with her back against the inside of the door, and let out one long, slow breath that she'd been holding since she walked outside. Then she went back to work. Caleb returned on the 4th day, riding hard with a leather satchel across his chest that he unstrapped before he was fully inside the house. "I found it," he said. Eloise stood up from the table. He pulled the document from the satchel, not the original but a certified copy properly stamped signed by Frank Webb as the authorized inheritor of his father's surveying records. The original had been filed with the Bernalillo County Records Office in 1871, missed in the chain because his father had filed it in the wrong county, an error of geography rather than negligence. The northern boundary of the dispute had sat close enough to the county line that his father had filed in the wrong jurisdiction, and no one had caught it because no one had needed to look until now. "It's complete," Caleb said. "The title chain is complete. There's no gap." Eloise took the document and read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down, squared it precisely on the table, and looked up at him with an expression that he had not seen on her face before, something that had released something that had been held tight since before he left and was only now letting go. "Good," she said. "Turner came while you were gone." Caleb went very still. "What happened?" She told him. "All of it, the man riding past the gate. Roy's visit, Turner's appearance, the conversation at the fence." She told it straight and factual, and Caleb listened without interrupting. And by the time she finished, he was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface and his jaw tight in the particular way it got when he was working hard to keep his response measured. "He came here alone," Caleb said. "Yes. He stood at my gate and told my wife she shouldn't trust me. Effectively, yes." "And you—" "I told him I saw exactly what he was doing," she said. "And I went back inside." Caleb looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said quietly, "You were alone out here for 4 days with Turner running pressure, and you handled all of it." "Pruitt was here," she said, "and Roy checked in." "That's not the same as—" He stopped, started again. "I should have thought more carefully before I left. You went to get what we needed," she said, "and you got it. That was the right decision. I knew what I was taking on when I agreed to stay. You weren't worried." She looked at him with that steady, full look. "I was worried," she said, "but I've been worried before and handled things anyway. That's generally how it works." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Turner underestimates you." "Most people do," she said simply. "I stopped being bothered by it a long time ago. It's actually quite useful." He thought about that. He thought about her standing at the gate, turning her back on Lawrence Turner, and walking to the house with even steps knowing Turner was watching, giving him nothing. He thought about her here for 4 days, working the property, watching the watcher, writing legal notes by lamplight, holding everything steady. "I owe you an apology," he said. She blinked. It was the first time he'd seen her look genuinely surprised. "For what?" "For thinking this was going to go one way," he said. "When Roy proposed this, I thought I was doing you a favor by agreeing to it. I thought you were coming here because you needed to be rescued. That was wrong." Eloise was quiet for a beat. Something moved across her face. Not quite emotion, but the place where emotion lives just beneath the surface. "What changed your mind?" "You," he said, and then looked away because the plainness of it embarrassed him slightly. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Caleb." He looked back. "I don't need your gratitude," she said, "but I'll take the apology." He almost smiled. This time, it got slightly further than almost. Roy came by that evening and they showed him the document, and his expression did the thing Caleb had started to recognize as Roy's version of profound relief. It looked almost like nothing at all. Just a slow nod and a quiet exhaling breath. But Caleb had known his uncle long enough to read the depth beneath it. "File a certified copy with the local county clerk tomorrow," Roy said. "Keep the original here, and get it to your lawyer." "We have a lawyer," Caleb said. "You do now," Roy said. "I retained one Monday. Name's Hathaway. He's in Las Cruces. He's careful, and Turner's Santa Fe man doesn't have sway down there." He looked at Caleb. "I wasn't going to tell you I was doing it until I'd done it." "Roy." "Someone had to," Roy said, not apologizing. "You two were managing the land. I managed this." He looked between them. "Turner's going to make one more move. I don't know what it is yet, but he doesn't let go easily, and he hasn't used everything he has." Eloise said, "What do you think he has left?" "Community," Roy said flatly. "The one thing you don't have yet. You're new, Eloise. Caleb's always kept to himself. Turner has relationships in this town going back 20 years. If he starts talking to the feed suppliers, to the cattle buyers, to the neighbors, whose cooperation you might need, he can make your life difficult without setting foot on your property again." The room went quiet. Caleb thought about the feed suppliers, about the cattle drive scheduled for next month and the buyers he'd need to deal with, about the water rights negotiation he'd been putting off with the Haverford family to the north. All of it required goodwill he'd taken for granted. All of it was suddenly less certain. He looked at Eloise. She was already thinking he could see it the way her eyes went somewhere interior and her hands went still. Then she came back and said, "Then we introduce ourselves." "What?" Caleb said. "To the town," she said. "Properly. Not as a business transaction, not as a rushed marriage, but as Caleb and Eloise Dawson, who run Thornfield Ranch and are part of this community. We show up, we attend things, we talk to people." She paused. "And we give them a version of us to know before Turner gives them his." Roy looked at her with an expression that was pure respect. "That's right," he said quietly. "That's exactly right." Caleb looked at his wife. This woman he had married under duress 4 weeks ago. This woman he had underestimated and misjudged and been wrong about in nearly every particular, and felt something shift in his chest that he had absolutely no framework for. He said, "When do we start?" "Sunday," she said. "Church. And I'll bring something to the potluck afterward." Roy made the cough laugh sound again. Caleb didn't try to stop the small, genuine smile this time. "She's going to be the end of Turner," Roy said, almost to himself. "He just doesn't know it yet." Sunday came, and Eloise wore the blue dress again, not because it was her only good one, but because she'd decided that if the town had already formed an opinion of her based on what she'd worn to her own wedding, she might as well give them the same woman to look at, and let them update their conclusions. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed, and she could tell by the way he held the wagon door a half-second longer than necessary, like he was thinking about saying something, and then decided against it. That she was learning was very Caleb. He thought twice before everything, which meant when he did speak, it usually landed with a weight that surprised her. They arrived at church 8 minutes before the service began, which was early enough to be seen walking in, but not so early as to seem desperate for attention. Eloise had thought about this. Caleb had not known she'd thought about it, but he followed her timing without question, which she appreciated. The reaction was immediate and human and exactly what she'd expected. Heads turned. Conversations softened. There was the particular silence of a room that is still talking but no longer about what it was talking about a moment ago. Eloise kept her chin level and her pace easy, and she smiled at Agnes Holt, her former neighbor, who smiled back with genuine warmth, and reached out and briefly pressed her hand, which helped more than Eloise would have admitted out loud. They sat in the third row. Not the back, which would read as hiding. Not the front, which would read as performing. The third row was simply where people sat when they belonged. Caleb sat beside her with the stiff posture of a man who had not attended church regularly in some years, and was now aware of it. And when the hymn started, he held the book and mouthed words he only partially remembered. And Eloise, without looking at him, without making it a thing, shifted her own book slightly toward him so he could read from hers. His shoulder relaxed by approximately half an inch. After the service, the potluck assembled in the side yard, the way small-town gatherings always do, with the particular organized chaos of people who have done this 100 times, and know exactly where to put their dish without being told. Eloise had brought a peach cake made from preserved peaches from the Carter cellar, and she set it on the table and then turned around and found herself face to face with Margaret Dunmore, who was 60, ran the town's lending library out of her front parlor, and had the honest, straight-talking manner of someone who had stopped caring about social softening sometime around age 45. "Eloise Carter," Margaret said. "Or Dawson, I suppose." "Dawson," Eloise said, "though Carter will probably stick for a while." "In this town, yes." Margaret looked at her with frank curiosity. "You look well." "I am well." "You look better than well. You look settled." Margaret tilted her head. "I expected you to look like a woman who'd made a desperate bargain." "I made a practical one," Eloise said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "A desperate bargain is when you take what's offered without considering whether it serves you. A practical one is when you look at the situation clearly and choose the option that gives you the most ground to stand on." She met Margaret's eyes. "I chose well. I'm choosing to stand on that." Margaret studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once firmly, the way a woman nods when she has made up her mind about something and will not revisit it. "I'll tell the lending library ladies that you're fine," she said. "They've been speculating." "Tell them whatever you believe," Eloise said. "You've got good judgment." Margaret laughed, a real one, short and genuine, and took a piece of the peach cake and walked away, and Eloise let out a quiet breath and turned to find Caleb standing 3 feet behind her, holding 2 cups of lemonade, with an expression that was somewhere between impressed and bemused. "You just won over Margaret Dunmore in 4 minutes," he said, handing her a cup. "Margaret Dunmore doesn't need winning over," Eloise said. "She needs honesty. Most people who seem difficult just need you to stop pretending at them." Caleb looked at her. "Is that what you do with me?" "It's what I do with everyone." He drank his lemonade and didn't say anything, but something in his expression shifted towards something she didn't have a word for yet. It was working. Slowly, visibly, it was working. By the end of the potluck, Eloise had spoken to 11 different people, and Caleb, following something like her lead, had spoken to 6, including a longer conversation with the Haverford son about the water rights discussion that had been stalled. A conversation that ended with a handshake and a scheduled meeting for the following week. That alone was worth the blue dress. On the ride home, Caleb said, "You planned all of that." "I planned the approach," she said. "The conversations went where they went. The Dunmore woman, the Haverford handshake. The way you put the cake on the table near the Prewitt family specifically because they supply feed and you wanted them to taste something you made. Eloise looked at him sideways. "You noticed that." "I notice things," he said. "I'm quiet. Quiet people notice." She was quiet herself for a moment. "I didn't plan every detail. I thought about what we needed and put ourselves in the place where it was most likely to happen naturally. There's a difference between manipulation and positioning." "You're good at it." "My father called it practical intelligence," she said. "The ability to read a room and understand what needs to happen, and make it happen, without anyone feeling handled." She paused. "It's what made me unmarriageable according to the town. Men don't generally enjoy being outthought." Caleb said without any detectable irony, "I don't mind it." She looked at him fully for the first time during the ride. He was watching the road, his profile steady and serious, and he didn't seem to notice he'd said anything unusual. "Good," she said finally, and looked forward again. Something had changed between them, small but real. The way ice changes in late February, still there. Still cold, but no longer impenetrable. So, Turner's next move came on Thursday, and Roy had been right about its shape. It started with the feed store. Caleb went in to place his regular monthly order and found that the pricing had changed, not dramatically, not enough to constitute obvious price gouging, but enough. 7% across the board on everything he ordered. He asked about it, and the owner, a man named Pickering, who had always been decent, looked uncomfortable in the way that meant the decision hadn't been his. "Someone's applied pressure," Caleb told Eloise that evening. "Turner's buying their debt," she said immediately, "or holding a note on the building. He doesn't need to say anything directly, he just lets people understand that cooperation with him costs less than resistance." "Pickering wouldn't look me in the eye." "No, he wouldn't." She thought for a moment. "Who else supplies feed in the county?" "There's a cooperative in Mesilla, 40 miles. Is the price difference worth 40 miles? "Over a year, yes. Significantly." "Then we move our account to Mesilla, and we let it be known we've done it without making it a conflict." She looked up at him. "And we tell Roy because Roy will tell the right people, and some of them will think about whether Turner is starting to apply the same pressure to their suppliers." Caleb sat with that for a moment. "You want to let other ranchers know Turner is squeezing the supply chain. I want the truth to be available to people who would want to know it," she said. "I'm not running a campaign. I'm just not hiding information that affects our neighbors." The next morning, Caleb rode to see Roy. And Roy listened, and then Roy went to see two men whose opinions carried weight in the county: Fletcher Dade, who ran the largest spread to the west, and an older rancher named Coombs, who had lived in the territory since before statehood and was regarded with the particular respect earned by simple longevity and consistent honesty. Caleb wasn't present for those conversations. But by the following week, he'd heard from 3 separate people that Turner had been refused a handshake at the Cattlemen's Association meeting. Nothing formal. Nothing that could be pointed to. Just the quiet withdrawal of goodwill, which in a small community meant more than any legal filing. Turner felt it. Caleb knew because Turner sent another man to the gate, not the watcher this time, but a representative with a formal written offer addressed to both of them for the combined Thornfield and Carter parcel. The number was substantial. The language was respectful. It was the offer of a man who was running out of indirect options and testing whether a direct one might yet succeed. Eloise read the offer once and handed it to Caleb without a word. Caleb read it and set it on the table. "No." "No?" she agreed. He looked at her. "We should send a written response, something that creates a record." "Hathaway should draft it," she said. "Not us. A lawyer's letterhead changes the tone." "You think we're heading to a legal fight?" "I think Turner has a lawyer, and we have a lawyer, and the question is, who blinks first?" She met his eyes. "We don't blink." "No," Caleb said, and meant it with more of himself than he expected. He found out what Turner had done to the Carters 16 days later, and it changed everything. It came from Margaret Dunmore, of all people, who appeared at the Thornfield gate on a Tuesday afternoon, with the purposeful energy of someone carrying information they have decided must be delivered in person. Caleb was out on the property. It was Eloise who brought her in, who listened, who stood in the kitchen without moving while Margaret talked. Thomas Carter. Eloise's father had died the previous spring, owing a debt that Eloise had not known existed. A private note not held by the bank, not filed through normal channels, but held personally by a holding company, whose principal, as best Margaret had been able to determine through the county records she'd spent 3 weeks quietly researching, was Lawrence Turner. The debt had been called in against the Carter estate immediately after Thomas died. Eloise had been protected from its full impact only because her father had put the 40 acres in her name directly 3 years before he died, which meant the land was legally hers, not part of the estate, and couldn't be claimed to satisfy the debt. But the rest, the tools, the livestock, the household assets, everything else her father had owned had been taken. Quietly, legally, efficiently. Turner had not simply been coveting the Carter land. He had engineered the conditions that made Eloise's situation desperate in the first place. Margaret finished talking. The kitchen was very quiet. "How long have you known?" Eloise asked. Her voice was steady. Her hands were flat on the table. "I found the first thread 3 weeks ago," Margaret said. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything. I'm certain now." She looked at Eloise with an expression that contained alongside the information something close to grief on her behalf. "I'm sorry, Eloise. Your father was a good man. He didn't understand what he was dealing with." After Margaret left, Eloise sat at the table for a long time. She was still sitting there when Caleb came in from the property an hour later. He took one look at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She told it exactly as Margaret had told it, fact by fact, without letting her voice change. And when she finished, Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And he didn't say anything immediately, which was the right thing. She didn't need words yet. She needed someone to sit with the weight of it alongside her. After a while, she said, "He killed my father's estate to force me into a corner so I'd have to sell to him or accept some other arrangement where he'd end up with the land." "Yes," Caleb said. "He didn't expect me to find another option." "He didn't expect Roy," Caleb said. "Or me agreeing. Or you saying yes." She looked at the table. "My father's things. His tools. His horses. All of it went to satisfy a debt he didn't know Turner held." She pressed her fingers together. "He died thinking he'd left me provided for. He didn't know that Turner had been holding a note over him for years waiting." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "What do you want to do with this?" She looked up. "I want to take him apart." The words came out with a controlled precision that was somehow more forceful than rage. Not hot-cold the way a clear winter morning is cold, exact, and merciless. "Not just the land," she said, "the whole thing. I want to find out how many other people in this county he's done this to. How many other families he's maneuvered into corners they didn't see coming. I want it exposed, not just for us, for all of them." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That's going to take more than a lawyer." "I know," she said. "It's going to take the Cattlemen's Association and the county records and probably a newspaper." She held his gaze. "Are you in or not?" He didn't hesitate. "I'm in." She nodded once, and the thing that had been sitting behind her eyes, the grief and the fury and the cold, determined calculation settled into something that looked almost like resolution. "Then we start tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I need to—" She stopped. "What?" he said. She looked at her hands on the table. "Tonight, I just need to sit with it for a bit, if that's all right." "Stay here," he said, getting up. "I'll make dinner." She blinked. "You cook?" "Badly," he said, "but I'm capable of it." And the smallest, most unguarded thing happened across her face. Then, not quite a smile, but the exact shape that lives just before one. The shape of a person who has been carrying something very heavy, suddenly noticing that someone else has their hand on it too. Hathaway. Their lawyer in Las Cruces received an urgent letter the next morning, and he wrote back within the week with 2 pieces of information that locked together like a key in a rusted lock. First Turner's holding company had filed similar private notes against at least 4 other properties in the county over the previous 8 years. Second, one of those properties, the Garza family ranch, which Turner had acquired 6 years ago, in what everyone assumed was a straightforward sale, had a surviving family member, a woman named Dorothea Garza, who had signed the sale documents under conditions that Hathaway described as potentially worth examining. Caleb read the letter aloud at the kitchen table while Eloise made notes. When he finished, she said, "Dorothea Garza, where is she now?" "Hathaway says she's in Santa Fe, working as a seamstress." "She lost her family's ranch and ended up in Santa Fe as a seamstress," Eloise said, and her voice was very quiet. "Because Turner held a note her family didn't know about." "We don't know that yet." "No," she said, "but I know it." Caleb folded the letter. "You want to go to Santa Fe?" "I want to write to her first," Eloise said. "A letter from a stranger showing up at her door might frighten her. A letter she can read in her own time that's different." She picked up her pen. "I'll tell her who I am and what I suspect and ask if she's willing to talk. She can say no. And if she says yes, then we go to Santa Fe," Eloise said, "and we find out exactly how long Lawrence Turner has been doing this and how many families he's left behind him in pieces." She looked up. "And then we figure out how to make sure it stops." She wrote the letter that afternoon 3 careful drafts before she was satisfied, and then sealed it and handed it to Caleb to send with the post. He held the envelope for a moment. There was a name on it, Dorothea Garza, and it contained words he hadn't read composed by his wife, who was not yet 2 months into a marriage that had been forced on both of them, fighting a battle that had started long before he understood what kind of battle it was. He thought about what Roy had said the night he'd met Eloise. "She's a practical woman. She understands the situation." Roy had known. Roy had understood something about Eloise Carter that Caleb hadn't. That practical didn't mean resigned, that understanding a situation meant looking at it completely and deciding what to do about it, not simply accepting its terms. He sent the letter. 4 days later, a reply came. It was short, 3 sentences written in a careful hand that looked like it had been formed under significant emotion, held tightly in check. "I know who you are. I know what Turner did. Come whenever you are ready, and I will tell you everything." Caleb read it and handed it to Eloise without speaking. She read it and set it down and was very still for a moment. Then she said, "We leave Saturday." He said, "I'll tell Roy." She looked at him. This man she had agreed to marry for practical reasons. This quiet, steady, serious man who had said, "I'm in," without a second's pause, when she'd told him she wanted to take Lawrence Turner apart. And she thought about her father, and about the tools and the horses and the life that had been dismantled while she wasn't looking, and about the 40 acres that had survived only because her father had been careful about one thing, the one thing Turner hadn't gotten to in time. And she thought about what it meant that she wasn't facing this alone. She had not expected that. She had not built that into her calculations when she'd sat across from Caleb Dawson at her kitchen table and told him exactly what she needed and exactly what she would give. She had planned for a functional arrangement. She had not planned for a partner. The difference she was beginning to understand was everything. They left for Santa Fe on Saturday morning, and Roy stood at the gate watching them go with an expression Caleb had come to recognize as the old man's version of prayer. Chin, slightly down, eyes tracking the wagon until it cleared the property line, jaw set like he was holding something in by force of will. Caleb raised a hand. Roy raised one back. Neither of them said anything because the thing that needed saying was already understood. This trip was the center of it. Everything they had done up to now, the filing, the lawyer, the church potluck, the letter to Dorothea Garza, had been building toward this. The ride to Santa Fe took 2 days. They stopped overnight at a way station midway, ate a plain meal, and slept in separate rooms without discussion, which was simply the arrangement and required no negotiation. What Caleb noticed, and what he had been noticing with increasing frequency for the past several weeks, was how little negotiation anything required with Eloise. She moved through decisions the way water moves through a channel, not forcefully, not rigidly, but finding the natural path with an efficiency that still caught him off guard. Most things in Caleb's experience required friction. His marriage against every expectation was producing very little of it. They talked on the road. Not constantly, there were long stretches of comfortable quiet, but more than they had talked at the beginning when conversation between them had been functional and precise. Now, it wandered occasionally. She told him about her father in the way people tell stories when they've moved past the sharpest edge of grief, fond, specific, occasionally funny. Thomas Carter had been a man of tremendous optimism and moderate ability, which combination had made his life more eventful than it needed to be. He had tried to grow tobacco in New Mexico once. He had attempted to build a second floor on the house using a method he had read about in a pamphlet. The second floor had lasted 3 weeks. Caleb listened and found himself telling her about his own father, in return a man almost opposite to Thomas Carter, precise and taciturn and productive, whose primary flaw had been an inability to express anything resembling warmth, which had left his son with a ranch and a work ethic, and a particular difficulty with feeling anything in the presence of another person without immediately wanting to be alone. "Is that why you never married?" she asked. Not unkindly, just the way she asked everything as if the truth was simply the most useful thing. "Partly," he said. "Also, I never found anyone who seemed worth the rearrangement." She was quiet for a moment. "And now?" He looked at the road ahead. "Ask me in a year." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Fair enough." Check. Dorothea Garza lived on the second floor of a narrow building 2 streets back from the Santa Fe Plaza, in rooms that were small and carefully organized, with the particular neatness of someone who has reduced their life to its essentials and made peace with the reduction. She was 51 years old, with dark eyes that held the permanent, careful watchfulness of someone who has been surprised badly once and intends never to be surprised again. She opened the door herself, looked at Eloise, looked at Caleb, and said, "Come in. I've had coffee ready since yesterday." They sat, and she talked. She talked for nearly 2 hours, and Caleb listened without interrupting, and Eloise asked questions in the quiet, precise way she had, not pushing, not leading, just opening the space for more. Dorothea's story had the shape of something that had been carried alone for a long time and needed the full unfolding to be properly told. The Garza family had ranched in Dry Creek County for 22 years. When her husband Esteban died of fever in 1878, Dorothea had been left with the ranch, 2 grown sons, and a debt she'd known about a normal banknote, manageable. What she hadn't known was that Esteban had borrowed separately privately from a land investment company called Meridian Holdings 5 years earlier, when a bad season had nearly broken them. He'd paid it back, or believed he had. He had a receipt. But Meridian Holdings, whose principal, as Hathaway, had eventually traced, was Lawrence Turner, claimed the payment had been applied to interest only, and the original principal remained outstanding, and upon Esteban's death, the full amount was due immediately. Dorothea had fought it. She'd hired a local lawyer who had, she later understood, been outmatched and possibly intimidated. The documents were legal. The terms, buried in language no ordinary person would parse, did in fact allow for the interpretation Turner's people asserted. She'd had to sell. Her sons, 18 and 20 at the time, had left the territory. She had come to Santa Fe. "The receipt," Eloise said. "The one Esteban had for his payment. Do you still have it?" Dorothea looked at her. "Yes." "May I see it?" The receipt was old, creased from handling, but legible. Eloise read it slowly. Then she passed it to Caleb without speaking, and he read it, and the thing he saw was what he suspected she'd already seen. The payment amount listed was identical to the full principal on the original note. Not an interest payment, the full amount. "This says principal paid," he said. "Yes," Dorothea said. "My lawyer said the word principal wasn't explicit enough, that it could be interpreted as a partial designation." "That's an absurd interpretation," Caleb said. "It was absurd," she said. "But the judge agreed with them." "Which judge?" Eloise asked. Dorothea told them the name. Caleb didn't recognize it. He looked at Eloise and saw that she had gone very still, in the particular way she went still when something had just confirmed something she'd already suspected. Roy needs to know that name, Eloise said to him quietly. Yes, he said. He already understood why. A judge who ruled consistently in Turner's favor on property disputes wasn't merely a legal obstacle. He was part of the machinery, and machinery that could be identified could be documented. And documentation placed in the right hands was a different kind of weapon than anything Turner had used against them. Dorothea was watching them with the careful eyes. "You're going to do something with this," she said. "If you'll let us," Eloise said. "Your story, your receipt with your permission. We want to bring this to the Cattlemen's Association and to a newspaper, not to expose you or your family to anything difficult, but because you're not the only one, and the others may not know they're not alone." Dorothea was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Caleb thought she might say no. Long enough that Eloise didn't press, just waited, which was exactly right. Then Dorothea said, "Esteban worked that land for 22 years. My sons grew up on it." Her voice was steady and quiet and absolute. "Do whatever you need to do. Use everything I've given you. I should have fought harder when I had the chance. I won't fail it again now." Eloise reached across the table and briefly put her hand over Dorothea's, and Dorothea looked at it and nodded once, and that was the end of that conversation, and the beginning of a different, larger one. They found the second family before they left Santa Fe. It happened because Dorothea, once she had made her decision, made it completely. She gave them two names. People she knew who had told her similar stories in the halting private way people share humiliations they're not sure are their fault. One name was in Albuquerque. The other was a family still living in Dry Creek County, the Whitfields, who ranched on the western side, whom everyone assumed had sold to Turner voluntarily 3 years ago because Harold Whitfield had simply said he'd gotten a good offer and moved his family to Arizona. "He didn't get a good offer," Dorothea said. "He got a threat." The private note and a very clear suggestion about what Turner's lawyer would do to his family's reputation if he refused to settle. Caleb drove home with that sitting in his chest like a stone. He knew Harold Whitfield. Not well, he'd been the kind of neighbor who appeared at the edges of community events and disappeared quickly, but he knew the family. He'd thought the sale was straightforward. He'd thought Turner had simply offered well. He said on the road back, "How many people in that county think Turner is just a hard but fair businessman?" "Most of them," Eloise said. "That's how this works. Each family that gets maneuvered out goes quietly, because they're ashamed or afraid, or both. Turner counts on the quiet. He needs the quiet. We're going to take the quiet away from him." "That's the plan," she said. He drove for a while. Then he said, "I want to go see the Whitfields." She looked at him. "They're in Arizona. I know where they are. Harold Whitfield has a brother in Tucson. That's where they went." He kept his eyes on the road. "I know what it's like to nearly lose a ranch you've worked your whole life. I know what it's like to feel like the ground is going out from under you. I want to talk to Harold, man to man. Tell him what we've found. Tell him he can be part of this." Eloise studied his profile for a moment. "That could take another week." "Yes." "The ranch. Roy will check in. Pruitt can handle the daily work." He glanced at her. "But if you think we should go straight home, we go straight home. This is your call as much as mine." She looked at him for a long moment. The fact that he'd said that your call as much as mine, plainly and without calculation, still registered as something new. She was still learning to receive it without flinching. "Write to Roy from the next town," she said. "Tell him we're extending by a week, and tell Hathaway to start compiling a formal account of what we have so far, the Garza note, the receipt, the judge's name, so it's ready when we come back." "You want to go to Tucson," he said. "I want to finish what we started," she said. "And I want Harold Whitfield to know he's not alone either." Harold Whitfield opened his brother's door in Tucson and looked at Caleb Dawson for a full 5 seconds without speaking. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with the particular deflated quality of someone who has been carrying a private weight so long the posture has become permanent. His eyes went from Caleb to Eloise and back to Caleb, and then he stepped back from the door and let them in without a word, which Caleb understood as its own kind of answer. They sat in the brothers' front room, and Caleb talked first this time. Not Eloise. Caleb. He told Harold what they'd found, what Dorothea had shared, what Hathaway had traced in the county records. He told it the way he told things plainly without embellishment, and Harold listened with the rigid posture of a man trying to hold himself together in front of people he doesn't know well enough to fall apart in front of. When Caleb finished, Harold said, "I signed those papers because he told me if I didn't, he'd go to the bank with information that would trigger an immediate call on my mortgage. Information I don't think he actually had. But I couldn't be sure. And I had my wife and 3 kids, and I couldn't risk it." "He bluffed you," Eloise said quietly. "Probably," Harold said. "I didn't know it at the time." "Most people don't," she said. "He counts on that too." Harold looked at his hands. 3 years in Arizona," he said. "My oldest boy keeps asking when we're going home, and I keep telling him soon, and I have no idea what soon means anymore." He looked up at Caleb. "What are you trying to do?" "Expose him," Caleb said. "Completely and publicly. The private notes, the debt manipulation, the judge, all of it. Once it's in the open in the association records in print, he loses the thing that makes the whole operation work, which is the ability to operate in the dark." "And what does that give me back?" There was a silence. Caleb didn't look away from Harold's face. "I don't know if it gives you the ranch back," he said. "I won't tell you it does because I'm not certain. The legal question of whether a sale made under duress is reversible is something Hathaway has to answer. But it gives you the truth, publicly, with your name cleared. And it gives your oldest boy an accurate story of why his family left, which is that his father was targeted by a dishonest man and handled it the best he could." He paused. "That's not nothing, Harold." Harold was very still. Then his jaw worked once, and he looked at the ceiling briefly, and when he looked back, his eyes were red-rimmed, but his voice was steady. "You need a signed statement." "Yes," Caleb said. "Witnesses. Hathaway will want 2. Harold nodded slowly. "My brother will witness. He was there when I told him what happened. He knows it all." He looked at Eloise then for the first time since they'd sat down. "Your father was Thomas Carter." "Yes," she said. "Good man," Harold said. "I heard he passed. I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said. And then, he would have wanted this. He would have wanted all of us to push back. Harold nodded one more time, the way someone nods when a decision has been fully made and the making is complete. "Then let's write the statement," he said. They rode out of Tucson with Harold Whitfield's signed statement folded in the same leather satchel that had carried the Frank Webb survey document home from Albuquerque, a satchel that was becoming, Caleb thought, the most consequential piece of luggage he had ever owned. 2 days from home. Eloise was quieter than usual, but not the closed quiet of the early days of their marriage. This was the quiet of someone processing something large. He'd learned to recognize the difference. On the second evening at the way station, they ate dinner at the common table alongside 3 other travelers, and afterward sat outside in the cooling air, and Eloise said without preamble, "I've been thinking about what happens after." "After Turner is exposed," he said. "After all of it. After the association meeting, after the newspaper, after whatever Hathaway does with the evidence." She looked at him. "The ranch question. What you and I are doing. Where it goes from here." He waited. "When I agreed to this arrangement," she said carefully, "I told you exactly what I needed and what I would give. I told you it could be functional without being anything more. I told you I didn't need—" She stopped. "What I'm trying to say is that I built a set of expectations that were designed to require very little from you emotionally, because I thought that was fair and I thought it was what the situation called for. And now," he said. She looked at her hands. "And now I'm not sure those expectations accurately reflect what this has become." She said it carefully, like each word was a step on ground she wasn't certain would hold. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know what to say, because what he had to say was bigger than he'd said in years, and he wanted to get it right. "Eloise," he said, "I agreed to this because I had no choice. I told myself it was a transaction and I would manage it respectably, and nothing would need to be more than it was. I was wrong about every part of that. Not because the circumstances changed, but because you weren't what I expected, and I couldn't keep treating it like a transaction once I understood who I was actually dealing with. She looked at him. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I never have been. My father didn't model it and I didn't practice it, and there are things I feel that I have no language for because no one ever gave me the words." He met her eyes directly. "But I want to try. If you'll let me." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something crossed her face, not the controlled assessment she usually showed the world, but something underneath it, something she kept behind the practical and the capable and the composed. It was brief, but he saw it. "I'll let you," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not soft or romantic in any conventional sense. But coming from Eloise, it was enormous, and he understood its size exactly, and that understanding felt more intimate than anything he could have imagined at the beginning of this. They were 2 hours from Dry Creek when the rider found them. He came fast from the direction of town, and Caleb recognized him at a distance. It was young Pruitt, their ranch hand, riding with the urgency of someone who has been watching the road for a long time and is relieved to finally see what he's been waiting for. Caleb pulled the wagon up. Pruitt pulled his horse alongside. He was breathing hard, and his expression was the expression of someone carrying news they wish they didn't have to deliver. "Mr. Dawson," he said. "Mrs. Dawson." He looked between them. "There's been a development. Mr. Turner filed a complaint with the county court 2 days ago." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "He's claiming the combined deed registration was fraudulent. He says the Carter parcel was subject to an outstanding lien at the time of the marriage, which would have made the transfer." "There was no lien on the Carter parcel," Eloise said sharply. "I know that with certainty. That parcel was clean." "Yes, ma'am," Pruitt said. "Mr. Roy says the same. But Turner's filed it and there's a court date set. And—" He hesitated. "What else?" Caleb said. Pruitt looked at him. "Turner's lawyer has filed something with the territorial governor's office. Something about the water rights on the northeastern section of the combined property. Roy doesn't have the full details yet, but Hathaway says it's a broader claim than the deed dispute. It touches both parcels." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at Eloise. Her face had gone very still. The kind of still that he now knew did not mean she was absorbing a blow. It meant she was already 3 steps ahead of the blow, already calculating, already building the response. "Turner knows we went to Santa Fe," she said. Not a question. "He has someone watching things," Caleb said. "He knows we found Dorothea Garza." She looked at Pruitt. "How long until the court date?" 3 weeks, Pruitt said. 3 weeks, she repeated, and something clicked behind her eyes. "He filed this because he knows what we're carrying in that satchel. He's trying to bury us in legal proceedings before we can make it public." She turned to Caleb. "If we're defending a fraudulent deed claim in court, the association meeting gets postponed. The newspaper story gets complicated by ongoing litigation. He keeps us occupied and contained." Caleb said, "Then we don't get contained." "No," she said. She looked at Pruitt. "Ride back to Roy. Tell him we're an hour behind you and we need everyone at Thornfield tonight. Roy Hathaway, if he can ride up from Las Cruces, and Margaret Dunmore." Pruitt blinked. "Margaret Dunmore. She's been researching Turner's record for months," Eloise said. "And she runs the town's information network better than anyone alive. We need her." She looked at Caleb. "Drive." Caleb drove. The last hour of the road home was the fastest he'd covered it, and Eloise sat beside him with the leather satchel across her knees. Dorothea's testimony. Harold's statement, the receipt. Hathaway's preliminary findings, and she held it with both hands, not anxiously, but with the deliberate intention of someone who knows exactly what they're carrying and why it matters. He thought about what she'd said 2 nights ago at the way station. What this has become. The words had stayed with him the way only true things do. sitting somewhere below the level of thought, changing the texture of everything around them. He thought about Roy at the gate that morning watching them leave. Roy, who had walked up to Eloise Carter's door 3 weeks before walking up to Caleb's, who had arranged a meeting and delivered a proposal, and watched two strangers figure out that they needed each other for reasons neither of them had anticipated, and Roy had probably seen before either of them had. "You'll thank me." Roy had said the day of the wedding. Caleb had said nothing. He was starting to accumulate things to say. Thornfield came into view in the late afternoon, the familiar roofline, the fence Eloise had helped him repair in the second week, the barn where she'd been working, by lantern light before dawn. Home in a way it had not been 3 months ago. Fuller somehow, with more at stake, which was not a feeling Caleb had expected to be grateful for, but found that he was. He pulled the wagon up to the gate. Roy was already there, standing with the particular alert readiness of a man who has been informed of a problem and has been waiting to do something about it. He looked at the satchel in Eloise's hands, and at her expression, and then at Caleb, and he said, "How much did you get?" Caleb set the brake. "Enough." Roy looked at Eloise. "Enough to finish it," she said, and stepped down from the wagon and walked toward the house. And every person who later heard the story of what happened in that room that night would understand that the moment Lawrence Turner filed that fraudulent claim, he had not outmaneuvered Eloise Dawson. He had just given her a deadline. The meeting that night lasted 4 hours, and by the end of it, the table was covered in documents, and the coffee had gone cold twice, and nobody had noticed either time. Roy sat at one end, Hathaway's written preliminary findings spread in front of him. Margaret Dunmore sat across from Eloise, with a stack of her own research, 3 weeks of quiet county records work that turned out to be more thorough than any of them had expected. Caleb sat beside his wife and said less than anyone else in the room, but watched everything with the focused attention of a man who understands that some battles are won in the planning and some are won in the execution, and the difference between them is whether you know which one you're in. They were in the planning, for now. Margaret had found 2 more names. Not families who'd been fully displaced, families who were currently in the middle of it, currently under pressure from Meridian Holdings, currently trying to figure out what the private notes they'd signed meant, and whether they had any ground to stand on. The Reyes family east of town, and a widow named Clara Fenn, who had inherited her husband's small cattle operation and received a payment demand letter 3 months ago that she'd shown to no one because she was ashamed and frightened. She thought she'd done something wrong, Margaret said, and her voice had an edge to it. She sat with that letter for 3 months, thinking it was her fault somehow. Eloise looked at the name. "I'll go see her tomorrow." "She may not want to talk," Margaret said. "She'll talk," Eloise said quietly. "When she understands, she's not alone." Hathaway, who had ridden up from Las Cruces in 6 hours flat, when Roy's message reached him, which told Caleb something about what Hathaway thought of the case they were building, laid out the legal landscape with the direct efficiency of a man who respects his clients enough not to soften hard information. Turner's fraudulent lien claim against the Carter parcel was exactly what Eloise had diagnosed, a delay tactic designed to tie up the combined deed in litigation and prevent them from moving forward cleanly. It was not a strong claim. The Carter parcel had been deeded directly to Eloise 3 years before Thomas Carter's death, which placed it entirely outside the estate's liability to any creditor, including Turner's Meridian Holdings. "He knows it won't hold," Hathaway said. "He doesn't need it to hold. He needs it to occupy us." "Then we don't let it occupy us," Eloise said. "You file the response to the lien claim, we handle that channel, and simultaneously we take everything else to the Cattlemen's Association." "The association meeting is in 11 days, Roy said. "That's our real deadline," Eloise said. "Not the court date. If the association sees the full evidence before Turner can spin it, the community pressure alone changes the calculation. His operation depends on the county believing he's a legitimate businessman. Once that belief is gone..." She stopped. "He's just a man with legal problems," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "And legal problems are much easier to fight than community reputation." Hathaway looked between them. The evidence you've brought back Garza's testimony, Whitfield's statement, the receipt, it's strong. But I want you to understand what you're doing. You're not filing a complaint. You're presenting this to a room full of ranchers and businessmen, some of whom have relationships with Turner, some of whom may have debts to him you don't know about. Some of them will resist this information because accepting it costs them something. I know, Eloise said. I've thought about that. And people who resist true information because accepting it is uncomfortable are not our target, she said. The ones in the middle are, the ones who haven't formed a hard opinion yet, the ones who've thought something was off but couldn't name it. She looked around the table. You give those people clear evidence and a room full of witnesses, and you let the truth do its job. Margaret Dunmore, who had been listening with the expression of someone hearing their own thoughts spoken aloud by another person, said, I want to be in that room. I was counting on it, Eloise said. Roy made the laugh-cough sound. Even Hathaway smiled briefly. The 11 days moved with the particular compressed intensity of a period of time that matters. Eloise went to see Clara Fenn the next morning and came back 2 hours later with Clara's signed account of the demand letter and the full history of her husband's dealings with Meridian Holdings. She told Caleb about the visit in 3 sentences because the important parts fit in 3 sentences. Clara had cried when Eloise explained what they'd found, then dried her eyes, then asked where to sign. The Reyes family was harder. Ernesto Reyes was proud and private, and had not told his wife the full extent of what was happening, which meant Eloise was navigating not just his resistance, but the collision of 2 people discovering together in real time that their situation was worse than one of them had admitted. Caleb was with her for that one, and he was glad he was, because what was needed in that room was not legal argument, but simple human presence. 2 people sitting across from 2 other people and saying plainly, we know what this feels like. We were almost there too. And here is how you are not alone in it. By the end of the hour, Ernesto Reyes had signed a statement, and his wife Maria had pressed Eloise's hand at the door and said in a voice she was clearly holding together by will, we thought we were the only ones. You were never the only ones, Eloise said. Turner counted on you thinking that. Hathaway filed the response to the lien claim on day 5, and the court issued a preliminary ruling on day 8 that described Turner's evidence as insufficient to establish the claimed encumbrance, which was legalese for exactly what Eloise had said. It was nothing. Turner's lawyer filed a motion to extend. Hathaway blocked it. The preliminary ruling stood. When Roy brought word of the ruling to Thornfield, Caleb was in the barn and Eloise was at the table reviewing her notes for the association presentation, and she looked at Roy when he told her, and then looked back at her notes and said, Good, that's one channel clear, and kept working. Roy looked at Caleb, who was standing in the doorway, and Roy's expression said everything that neither of them said out loud. This woman was something else entirely, and both of them had known it for different lengths of time, and for once, Roy was not even slightly smug about being first. The night before the association meeting, Caleb found Eloise outside. It was late. The house was quiet. He'd gone to get water and seen the door to the yard standing open and found her standing at the fence line, not looking at anything in particular, just standing in the night air with her arms crossed and her thoughts wherever they were. He came and stood beside her. Can't sleep, he said. I can sleep, she said. I came out to think. About tomorrow, about all of it. She was quiet for a moment. I keep going over the presentation. Whether the order is right, whether Hathaway should speak first or whether Roy should, whether starting with Dorothea's story is too emotional or exactly emotional enough. Exactly emotional enough, Caleb said immediately. She looked at him. Dorothea Garza lost 22 years of her family's work, he said. The room needs to feel the weight of that before they see the legal documents. If you lead with law, they'll think it's an abstract dispute. If you lead with Dorothea, they'll understand what's actually at stake. He paused. You know this. You've known it since Santa Fe. She was quiet for a moment. I just needed to hear you say it. He looked at her. You're nervous. Yes. She said it like the admission cost something. I know what I'm doing. I believe in what we've built. I'm still nervous." "That's because it matters," he said. She turned to look at him fully in the darkness. "I've been thinking about something else too," she said. "About this. About what you said at the way station." She met his eyes steadily. "I spent 6 years being told in various ways that I was too much, too direct, too capable, too opinionated to be a good wife. And I stopped believing that marriage could be something that didn't require me to be less than I am. So when Roy came to my door, I thought, I can do this, but I'll have to manage the distance, keep it functional, not ask for more than it was supposed to be." "And," he said. "And you have never once asked me to be less than I am," she said. "Not once. In 4 months." She held his gaze. "I don't know if you understand how rare that is." Caleb was quiet for a moment, because the thing rising in his chest was large, and he still didn't have perfect language for it, but he was going to try, because she deserved the attempt. "I spent 6 years alone on this ranch," he said, "because I told myself I was better at it alone, that the complications of another person weren't worth it, that I was the kind of man who did things by himself, and it was enough." He stopped. "It wasn't enough. I just didn't have anything to compare it to." He looked at her. "I'm comparing it now." She didn't say anything for a moment. The night was quiet around them, the particular quiet of open land that is inhabited and cared for cattle, sounds in the distance, the fence Eloise had helped repair, holding steady the ranch that had been almost lost and was still standing. Then she said, "Caleb." "Yes. I think I love you." She said it the way she said everything directly, without the softening edges most people use to protect themselves. Just the truth placed in the air between them, real and unretracted. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "I know I love you. I've known for a while. I didn't have the right to say it until you were close to it too." She made a sound that was a real laugh, short and genuine and surprised, and it was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. "You were waiting," she said. "I'm patient." "You're impossible," she said, but she was smiling. Actually smiling, the full, unguarded version that she didn't show the room, the one that changed her face into something he was beginning to understand he would spend a considerable amount of his life trying to earn. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. Her fingers settled between his, with the naturalness of something that had been finding its way there for months and had simply arrived. They stood there for a while, not saying anything else, not needing to. The Cattlemen's Association meeting was held in the largest room at the town hall, and it was full. Word had moved through the county in the quiet but efficient way that Roy Dawson managed information, not announced, not advertised, but placed with the right people who told the right others, so that by meeting day there were 47 people in a room that normally held 30, and the faces included every major ranching family in the county. 3 local businessmen, the editor of the Dry Creek Gazette, and Lawrence Turner. Turner had come. Caleb registered that from across the room, Turner standing near the far wall with 2 of his men and his lawyer watching the assembly, with the easy confidence of a man who believes he controls what's about to happen. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Eloise. He smiled with his mouth and let the smile say what it was saying. Eloise looked back at him for exactly 1 second, long enough to let him know she saw him, and then she looked away and set her papers on the table, and didn't look at him again. Fletcher Dade, who chaired the association, called the meeting to order. He gave the floor to Hathaway, first a procedural choice that Eloise had suggested, and Roy had agreed with because establishing legal framework before testimony gave the room context for what they were hearing. Hathaway spoke for 8 minutes cleanly, and without ornament, the nature of Meridian Holdings, the structure of the private notes, the pattern of debt manipulation across 6 families over 8 years. The judge whose rulings had consistently favored Turner's claims, the lien filing against the Carter parcel that had been dismissed by a preliminary court ruling 3 days prior. The room was very quiet by the end of 8 minutes. Then Eloise stood up. She didn't have notes in her hand. She'd read them so many times they were inside her. She looked at the room, at the ranchers and their wives, and the businessman and the editor, and she said simply, "My name is Eloise Dawson. My father was Thomas Carter. He died last spring believing he'd left me provided for. He hadn't, because Lawrence Turner held a private note against his estate that my father didn't fully understand and couldn't have anticipated would be called the way it was. Everything my father had built except 40 acres he'd deeded to me directly was taken to satisfy that note. She paused. My father was a good man. He was not a stupid man. He was simply a man who trusted the wrong person. She looked at the room. He was not the only one. She told Dorothea Garza's story. She told Harold Whitfield's story. She told Clara Fenn's story and the Reyes family's story. And she told each one with the specific human detail that made it real. The names of children. The number of years worked the exact moment each family understood they had lost something that couldn't be recovered. She did not dramatize. She did not editorialize. She simply told the truth clearly and let the truth be as heavy as it was. By the fourth story, there were people in the room who were not keeping their composure entirely. By the fifth, Lawrence Turner's lawyer leaned over and said something to Turner, and Turner's expression had changed from easy confidence to something controlled and harder underneath. When Eloise finished, she sat down. Fletcher Dade asked if anyone wished to speak. Turner's lawyer stood up and began a rebuttal procedural objections questions about the validity of signed statements, language about civil disputes and misunderstandings. He was competent and smooth, and said everything correctly. Nobody in the room was listening to him the way they'd been listening to Eloise. Caleb could feel it. The shift had already happened somewhere between Dorothea's 22 years and Clara Fenn sitting alone with a letter for 3 months. You cannot reclose a room once it is open to the truth. Turner's lawyer was speaking to doors that were already shut against him. When the lawyer finished, Margaret Dunmore stood up without being called on, which was Margaret's particular style, and said in the carrying voice of a woman accustomed to being heard in rooms that weren't listening, I want to know how many people in this room have received a private loan from Meridian Holdings or any associated company. She looked around steadily. You don't have to answer aloud. But I want you to be asking yourself that question right now, because if you have, you need to know that what Hathaway described today is a pattern, and patterns are applied consistently. The silence after that was absolute. 3 people in the room, Caleb later found out, were currently holding notes with Meridian Holdings. All 3 of them were at that meeting. None of them spoke during the meeting. All 3 of them came to speak with Hathaway privately the following week. Turner left before the formal vote. He walked out with his lawyer and his 2 men while Fletcher Dade was still framing the resolution language, and the walk itself was its own statement, a man who had read the room and understood that the thing he'd been building for 8 years had just had its foundation removed. He walked with the same confident posture he'd always carried, but the posture was now carrying something else underneath it, something that looked to Caleb's eye like a man calculating the cost of a rapid retreat. The vote to refer the Meridian Holdings pattern to the territorial governor's office passed 41-3. The 3 who voted against were later discovered to have their own complicated financial relationships with Turner, which became part of a second investigation the following spring. The editor of the Dry Creek Gazette, a small, careful man named George Aldous, who had been in the room for all of it and had said nothing. Throughout came to Eloise afterward with his notebook and asked if she would speak on the record. Yes, she said, all of it on the record. The story ran 4 days later front page, with a full accounting of the Meridian Holdings operation, named families who had consented to be named, and Hathaway's legal summary of what the pattern constituted. It was picked up by the Albuquerque paper a week after that. The territorial governor's office acknowledged receipt of the association's referral within 10 days. Turner left Dry Creek County 6 weeks later. He did not say where he was going. His properties were acquired by a holding company, a legitimate one, as far as Hathaway could determine, and his land office closed, and his house stood empty. And the people of Dry Creek County, who had thought of him for years as a hard but fair businessman, adjusted their memory of him with the particular efficiency people use when they discover they've been deceived and would prefer to have known better all along. Dorothea Garza's case was reopened. The sale of the Garza Ranch was examined for duress conditions. It took 18 months, but the court found in her favor, and the property, which Turner's former holding company was required to sell at a court-determined price, was purchased by a consortium of county ranchers with Caleb and Eloise among them, and held in trust until Dorothea's oldest son could return and take possession. Harold Whitfield came back from Arizona in the spring. His oldest boy ran across the yard of the family ranch on the day they returned, and Harold stood at the gate and watched his son's boots hit that familiar ground and made a sound that wasn't quite crying, and wasn't quite not crying. And Eloise, who was there for the return, put her hand briefly on Harold's arm and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying better. A year after the wedding, Caleb rebuilt the front porch. It had been functional but rough when Eloise arrived, and he'd been meaning to get to it since before the foreclosure notice, and it had kept getting displaced by more urgent things. But the urgent things were behind them now. The deed was secure. The ranch was profitable in a way it hadn't been since his father's time. The retention pond Eloise had planned in their first week was holding water through the dry season exactly as she'd predicted, and the Haverford water rights agreement was signed and fair to both parties. He rebuilt it properly with good wood, and Eloise came out on the third day of the work and watched him for a while, and then picked up a hammer and helped without asking whether she was needed. They worked through the afternoon together, and when they were done, they sat on the new boards, and the wood was solid and level and built to last. Roy came by that evening, as Roy tended to, with no particular excuse for the visit, except that it was evening, and there was coffee. He sat in the chair Eloise had designated as Roy's chair, because he occupied it every time, and there was no point pretending otherwise. He looked at the two of them, at Caleb and at Eloise, who was leaning slightly toward her husband, with the ease of a woman completely settled in where she was, and Roy drank his coffee and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You're going to thank me eventually." Caleb looked at Eloise. Eloise looked at Caleb. She said, "He's been waiting to say that for a year." "Longer than that," Caleb said. He looked at Roy. "Thank you, Roy." Roy made a sound that was pure satisfaction, deep and genuine, and not bothering to disguise itself. "Good," he said. "Now who's making dinner?" Eloise was already standing. "I am," she said. "Sit down, both of you." Roy sat. Caleb sat. The porch held them solidly, the new wood doing exactly what new wood built with care is supposed to do. He thought about the letter he'd crumpled in his fist 12 months ago, the 60-day notice, the bank room where Roy had said marry her, and Caleb had looked at Gerald Pruitt and found no exits. He thought about the woman across from him at a plain kitchen table who had told him without softening anything exactly what she needed and what she would give. He thought about all the ways he had been wrong, and all the ways being wrong had been the best thing that had ever happened to him. From inside the house, the sound of Eloise moving through the kitchen, certain and unhurried, filled the space the way she had filled every space she'd entered in his life, completely without apology, making it better than it was before she arrived. Caleb Dawson had been handed a marriage he didn't want, by a man who understood him better than he understood himself, and had found inside it the one thing he had spent 29 years working around the edges of, without ever finding the center. He had been afraid of love his entire life. He had simply not known that was what the emptiness was called. Eloise Carter. Dawson had named it for him the way she named everything, plainly, accurately, and without giving him any room to pretend he hadn't heard. He heard it. He was grateful for every word of it. And the life they built together on that ranch, stubborn and honest, and fought for with everything they had turned out to be the most solid thing either of them had ever put their hands to. Not because it was easy, because it was true. And truth held steady between two people who refused to let it go is the only foundation that never fails.